Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Mainstream Indie Music channel. Yes, it is going to be another pop punk video. I really appreciate the love and support that you guys have given this channel. Even though you guys kind of have to be taken along to my weird music tastes from time to time, especially lately, done a lot of pop punk things. So I thought I would just include one more thing, and it's going to be a deep dive video. So a little different than our usual ones, where we kind of stick to like one topic or one band. And this week, the pop punk that I'm talking about, because you got to be a little bit specific, right? Is the pop punk that originated in the early 2000s stretching forward. And yes, we are going to get into modern day pop punk as well. In fact, pretty much if you just look at the screen right now, these are the types of bands that I'm talking about, right? Fall Out Boy, My Chemical Romance, Paramore, you got Green Day, Blink-182, and so on and so forth. But there are people that have said not only is pop punk alive today, but it's almost getting a resurgence. And it's a little different. So people like Olivia Rodrigo, Machine Gun Kelly, Willow, and so on and so forth kind of spearhead the start of the modern day pop punk bands. And so to really begin, not only do we have to rewind time a little bit back to that earlier genre and period of time that I talked about in the beginning, but we have to really take a look at what pop punk is and what kind of drove it to the top of the charts in the early 2000s. Then, of course, we will talk about what has happened to it since, maybe even what's called the death of pop punk. But whether or not it did in fact die, or whether or not simply if it got resurrected, that's what we are going to talk about, right? So pop punk in the early 2000s was a lot different than what it is today. Because today you could say that it's existing, but it's underground. Back then, it was top of the charts, and there was many reasons for that. What comes to your mind when you think of bands like Yellow Card, like Good Charlotte, like Green Day, for example, Blink-182, My Chemical Romance? Well, you probably think of that certain period of time in the early 2000s, right? Now, don't get me wrong. Punk as a genre has been around for a very long time. It especially became kind of rampant after the 1970s, because after the 1970s, people were kind of looking for a palate cleanser after the genre of disco had died down. And people almost went to the opposite extreme, right? Where disco is seen as very kind of happy, focusing on dance and so on and so forth. People almost wanted to go the exact opposite and say, hey, we want to listen to music that expresses maybe anger, sadness, other emotions that I may be feeling. And so punk was born. You think of bands like The Clash, right? Back then, and other bands likewise. Now, I kind of stopped the list short, you may have noticed there. That was purposeful. Because in the 1990s, pop punk is not the same as grunge, right? Because you definitely had your explosion of grunge bands. And punk also, I would not classify as your regular rock and roll, because you had bands such as, AC/DC. You had bands such as U2. You had bands such as Pink Floyd. Kind of think of like your classic rock bands, Queen, right? Pop punk is definitely not that. And so after the 90s really stretch of grunge music, of course, spearheaded by one of the biggest ones, Nirvana. Maybe think of Pearl Jam as well. Think of Audioslave, so on and so forth. Bands didn't really know how to keep it going, and frankly, a lot of the masses kind of just moved on from the grunge era. Now, what emerged from the grunge era, think of bands, especially two in particular, which maybe spearhead the pop punk genre: Green Day and Blink-182. Now, are there other ones involved? Well, of course. You think of Sum 41, and then you think of bands that maybe kind of paved the path for the pop punk genre that came out of the ska genre from the 1990s, like your Less Than Jakes, like your Mighty Mighty Boss Tones, right? Like your bands like Goldfinger as well. That led to the aforementioned bands that I mentioned in the beginning of this video. Now, that leads to our second question. What kind of kept the staying power of pop punk? What kept it alive? And then what happened to pop punk? Well, there are several things that kept pop punk alive. Number one is definitely MTV. MTV was playing Green Day, Sum 41, Blink 182. These guys were top of the charts back then, right? And I'm not even getting into the days of like Fall Out Boy and so on and so forth yet. This is even pre-Fall Out Boy when they got big. But even bands like Jimmy Eat World, are just all over the place. And MTV kept them not, such underground, but it really casts them to the forefront. There's an awesome YouTube video that discusses what happened to music in the 2000s going into the 2010s. And it's such an interesting genre and period of time for your music taste. If you grew up, if you were a teenager, if you were in your 20s in that period of time, you really were extremely lucky. Because the internet helped also evolve music. Because I remember, I'll even take my own example here as a kid. On one hand, I'm listening to, Green Day, I'm listening to Goldfinger, Blink 182, but then at the same time, I'll be with my friends and we're also listening to, Lil Wayne, Jay-Z. We're even listening to Beyonce, Mariah Carey. Right? All of this is just this one big stew of music that's happening at the exact same time. And people were very open to it. I knew people that listened to just hip hop and rap, but then if you mentioned Green Day, Blink 182, they knew exactly who these people were. And then eventually going into like Fall Out Boy and so on and so forth, Panic at the Disco. Everybody knew who these bands were. Everybody listened to this genre of music. And MTV was a big reason for it. But it wasn't only MTV. Movies and television shows, which I've highlighted on this channel, along with another thing that I've highlighted on this channel, video games, kept pop punk alive. Because it didn't matter what your background was, what your culture was. If you played any kind of sports games, and when I say sports, I mean anything from Madden to NBA 2K, and then even to other sports, right? Baseball, if you played SSX, if you played ATV, and then of course you go into like the Need for Speeds and Burnouts, for example. You got such a huge mix of songs that really, I know sometimes, myself included, I was too lazy to go into the settings. Sometimes there weren't even ways to turn the music off or turn some songs off. Yes, there were that did have that feature, but a lot of times you kind of just let the music play out, and again, that's what got you into that different genres, right? And that's what kept it alive. Now, a lot of times I've seen this, and this is very interesting. What led to, if there was indeed a death of the pop punk genre? Around the 2010s at this point, pop punk was still going. Like I said, I earlier talked about the early 2000s. Now going into the late 2000s and early 2010s, into the mid 2010s, new bands started to pick up the slack and change things, right? Like I said, Fall Out Boy, All American Rejects, Panic at the Disco. They were starting to lead a new wave of pop punk. And there's a couple specific things that happen that I've seen online that's being discussed about if pop punk did indeed die, this may have been the reasons why. Number one, the end of Blink 182. You know, Tom DeLonge again went off into his own thing. Number two, the flop of the All American Rejects' fourth album, When the World Comes Down. Ironically, one of my favorite All American Rejects albums, but I digress. You imagine how huge All American Rejects' previous album was, Move Along. That album was everywhere. And when they followed it up with When the World Comes Down, it was not received well, minus the song Gives You Hell. Other than that, it did not do good at all. And number three was the retirement of Fall Out Boy and then the return of Fall Out Boy with a completely drastic changed style of music. Now listen, I love Fall Out Boy. I do. I listened to their early stuff. I listened to their stuff when they started to get popular, and I've listened to their new stuff since then. But there is no doubt that after Folly Ado, Fall Out Boy, and then, of course, their retirement or their hiatus, had to completely change their song and their sound. Now, was it for the better or for the worse? Well, I'll let you be the judge of that. But those events all tied together kind of led to the decline of pop punk, at least for a period of time. Now, like I've said, I would say around 2020, there started to be an influx of pop punk once again. So whether or not, if you believe pop punk as a genre died, you know, again, hey, I'll leave that up to you. But if it did, it was not dead for long. You know, we're only counting maybe a handful of years. Now, I will say this, though. Does it have the hold on the mainstream audience as it once had? Well, again, I'll let you be the judge of that. There's no question that people like Machine Gun Kelly, Willow Smith, and especially people like Olivia Rodrigo dominate the headlines and the attention of young people, especially on social media. Now, does it have the hold that it did back in the 2000s? I would venture to say no. You know, back then it was all over the place. But am I ragging on this new genre of music, of pop punk? I gotta say no. You know, there's definitely studies that say, hey, if you're older, don't give up on music yet. You know, keep waiting until your 30s to keep it going. But I want to pass that on to you guys. This is pretty much the quick synopsis of pop punk. What do you guys think? Is it still alive? Is it dead? Share your thoughts in the comments. I'll see you.